Professor David Harel, President of the Israel Academy, members of the Academy, colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm both deeply honored and truly delighted to formally introduce Christoph Markschies as a guest of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Since 2004, Markschies has been teaching early church history at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and since 2020, he has been the president of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, Berlin-Brandenburg Akademie der Wissenschaften, as well as, since 2022, president of the Union of German Academies of Sciences and Humanities. From 2006 to 2010, he was president of the Humboldt University. He was awarded the Leibniz Prize, the highest academic distinction of the DFG, in 2001. And in 2017, he was awarded the Federal Cross of Merit. He has received three honorary doctorates from the universities of Sibiu in Romania, Oslo, and the Pontifical Lateran University. Markschies is a member of various academies and has been a fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, as well as the Israel Institute of Advanced Studies in Jerusalem. He sits as well on various scientific advisory boards. Markschies studied theology in Marburg, Munich, Tübingen, and Jerusalem, and has taught in Jena and in Heidelberg before coming to Berlin, where he holds, in the theology faculty, the Harnack Chair, which honors the memory of Germany's leading patristic scholar. The list of his publications, even only of his books, is too long to be recounted here, and I'll only mention the fact that it spans a number of fields: Gnosticism, both the heresiographical tradition and the Coptic Gnostic texts, late antique Christianity, Latin and Greek Christian theological literature, in particular Origen, Ambrose, Augustine, and the history of religions in antiquity with a focus on Manichaeism. Markschies, who of course usually publishes in German, is a true master of Goethe's language, and reading him provides deep satisfaction. It is a good thing, however, that many of his books are now extant also in English. Here I'll mention only his massive God's Body, Jewish, Christian, and pagan images of God. God seems to have a big body and deserves a big book. Let me add that he excels in highly varied genres of scholarship, such as textual editions and translations, commentaries, monographs, and synthesis in a number of fields. He is as good at doing meticulous, detailed research as at using his brush for painting broad synthetic perspectives. He perceives the forest as a whole, but also knows all its trees. Beyond the amazing span of his scholarly input, he is a leader of collective research, establishing teams, networks, launching research projects and conferences. You may easily infer from what I have said so far that Christoph Markschies is today, internationally, one of the leading scholars of early Christianity in its many aspects. I first met Christoph 30 years ago or so at the Cinematheque in the Gehenna, obviously the perfect place for a meeting of scholars of religion. That chat was the beginning of a long friendship, soon to be extended to our wives, and of a conversation that is still going on. Incidentally, it is on Mount Zion, when both were students at the Dormition Abbey, that Christoph met his wife, Eva. I was lucky to convince him to join in 1999 a research group I was coordinating with our vice president, Margalit Finkelberg at the Institute of Advanced Studies. In the autumn of 2014, I even co-taught with him a course in Berlin. I'm still grateful for his and the students' patience with my halting German. For years, Christoph has been deeply involved in various cooperation activities with the Hebrew University, such as the Martin Buber Society of Fellows. But it is for his combining human qualities such as generosity to a boundless intellectual curiosity that I am especially thankful. Professor Mark Schiess will now address us on risks and benefits of paradigms in the humanities, the history of religions in antiquity as an example. Christoph, the floor is yours.
I'm deeply moved by the greeting, dear David, and by your words, Guy, and I'm deeply moved to be here. Solidarity is not only a question of words, not only a question of subscribing declarations, but of traveling, being here, and presenting what I'm doing not only because of my own research, the whole enterprise that I have to think about paradigms was Guy's idea. So I'm bringing back as a sign of solidarity what I got to a certain extent from colleagues and friends here. So, if we want to think about the advantages and disadvantages of paradigms, dear friends, dear colleagues, dear presidents, former president of the Academy, and if the study of the history of religion in antiquity is to serve as an example for this, we must first at least briefly agree on what we want to understand by this vague term paradigms. Such an understanding is necessary because the term paradigm is not only vague, but is often used very vaguely, and I'm an enemy of vague terms, as you can easily imagine. This first part of my lecture today will be followed in a second part, and there is, as always with German lecturers, a clear-cut form of structuring the lecture, 3 parts, beginning, middle part, and end. The beginning is on the vague term of paradigm and paradigms. The second part is a relative simple and short history of research. A very simplified history of research on an ancient movement that is called in modern research Gnosticism, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, focused on a few observations and only on our thematic context. And in a third, and I promise very short concluding part, I will then interpret my research history, my attempt of research history, with the help of the category paradigm, and on the basis of this interpretation, say something about the advantages and disadvantages of paradigms for the humanities. So, first part, paradigms in the humanities, on the history of concepts. Most histories of the term paradigm begin with the American physicist and philosopher of science Thomas Samuel Kuhn, who was trained as a solid-state physicist at Harvard University and worked as a radar technician during the Second World War, before holding professorships in the history and philosophy of science at Berkeley, Princeton, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge. But there are always these wonderful buts. But Kuhn was not, as one can read again and again, the first to use the Greek term paradigma, which means proof, example, pattern, model, or archetype, metaphorically for a set of fundamental concepts that at a given time define a scientific discipline or certain parts. That's an attempt of definition, a set of fundamental concepts that at a given time define a scientific discipline or certain parts of it as a kind of disciplinary matrix, as a general consensus. As early as 1971, the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg not only pointed out that Kuhn himself associated his famous first use of the term in his much discussed book on the structure of scientific revolutions, first published in 1962, with a stay at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences in Stanford. Blumenberg pointed out that the Göttingen scholar Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, a physicist like Kuhn himself, and also a philosopher of science like Kuhn himself, used the term paradigm metaphorically in a similar way to Kuhn. Lichtenberg may indeed be the inventor of a scientific theoretical use of the term paradigm. Also, the clearest passage that Blumenberg cites as proof can only be proven from a not particularly widespread memory of a lecture of Lichtenberg, not a direct source, Lichtenberg, but a memory on a lecture by Lichtenberg by a contemporary Austrian Protestant theologian. It can be assumed with good reason that the metaphorical use of the word that Lichtenberg coined was conveyed to Thomas Kuhn by Ludwig Wittgenstein, whom Kuhn read at Stanford or had already read before. This is wonderfully argued by Daniel Sederbaum 40 years ago, but overlooked by most of the people using the term paradigm. Sederbaum quotes some relevant passages, but surprisingly not the clearest passage from Lichtenberg's lectures, which can be found in Blumenberg and was known to him via Wittgenstein. Lichtenberg said in the lecture, I quote, "Astronomy gives the most beautiful example of the great usefulness of hypotheses. The Copernican system is now almost completely beyond all doubt. It is, as it were, the paradigm, the Copernican system, the paradigm according to which all other discoveries should be declined. This is where the human mind has penetrated furthest and deepest." End of quotation. Remarkably, if the memory of the lecture by a Protestant Austrian theologian minister is correct, Lichtenberg characterizes the Copernican system as a hypothesis that is hardly doubted anymore, and thus, as a theory in practical astronomy, has the function of a school example in grammar, as a paradigm. The theory as the paradigm by which the student learns the declension of all other nouns of the same stem type. And that is precisely the meaning of the Greek word paradigma. This is why this is called paradigm in ancient grammatical and rhetorical literature. Like the paradigm in grammar, the Copernican system thus functioned as a disciplinary matrix, according to which other discoveries can be declined as it were, and are also in fact declined, brought into correct scientific form. At this point, however, because this is a lecture and not a series of lectures, we do not need to explain in detail the concept of paradigm in Lichtenberg and his reception via Wittgenstein. There is a lot of things to say, but I will stop here. But we can already understand from what has been explained so far which conceptual path leads from a classical meaning of the Greek word paradigma, example, to the metaphorical use as a disciplinary matrix that is not present at all in the individual, mediated within the framework of socialization in a disciplinary, specialized knowledge culture. But this also brings us back to Kuhn himself. This is Kuhn himself again, and these are two quotations which I like to analyze with you. In a 1969 postscript to his work, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, Kuhn distinguishes two fundamental meanings, and that's a little bit confusing, of the term paradigm, used by him in response to a variety of criticisms. In this way, once again introduced the original meaning example of the Greek term paradigma into the contemporary concept of the philosophy of science in a different way to Lichtenberg. I quote Kuhn, "On the one hand, it," that means the concept of paradigm, "stands for the whole constellation of opinions, values, methods shared by the members of a given community. On the other hand," second meaning, "it denotes an element in this constellation, the concrete solutions to problems which, used as models or examples, can replace explicit rules as the basis for solving the other problems of normal science." With Lichtenberg, dear ladies and gentlemen, with Lichtenberg, one could simply interpret the second meaning of Kuhn as a function of the first meaning in the concrete case of application, and thus make a contribution to clarifying Kuhn's often lamented terminological vagueness. The two meanings are combinable by using Lichtenberg's idea of a paradigm which helps to decline. Furthermore, it seems to be a detail central to our context that Kuhn, in his working definition of the term paradigm, in his 1962 book on the structure of scientific revolution, emphasized an active component of a first generation in the elaboration of a paradigm and a passive one in the second and each subsequent generation. In other words, paradigms are originally, according to Kuhn, individual research achievements of rank, as with Lichtenberg, who famously wrote a major biography of Copernicus. The Copernican system is a research achievement of one single researcher, Nicholas Copernicus. And I quote again Kuhn, "Of these, the paradigmata, paradigms, I believe that they are generally recognized scientific achievements that provide models and solutions to a community of experts from a certain period of time." At the same time, however, Kuhn emphasized elsewhere in his well-known monograph that the fundamental and methodological implications of the achievements that established a paradigm are often no longer fully clear to researchers who work with such paradigms in the second generation and in the following third, fourth, and so far. So to speak, I quote, "Scientists work according to models that they have acquired through their training and subsequent influence from the literature often without knowing or even needing to know exactly which characteristics have given these models the status of community paradigms. Paradigms are therefore not invisible, as Kuhn says somewhat exaggerately, but are no longer present as research achievements in all details of the second and all subsequent generations, as long as they function as such and form the basis of scientific work comparatively unquestioned. However, this dimension of Kuhn's term paradigm in particular has been sharply criticized, for example, by Sir Karl Popper, because it has deeply shaken the self-image of science and humanities as an objective practice based on rational and verifiable grounds. However, it seems to me that they describe at least a part of the practice of science, namely in particular the part that is not first and foremost characterized by an interest in the discussion of methods. Of course, one could ask whether the strict differentiation between a first generation of conscious production and a second and third generation of rather unconscious reception really describes the practice of science sufficiently, or whether productive and productive receptive phases do not alternate with purely receptive phases in the second generation, and even more in the so following generations, without immediately leading to revolutions and new paradigms. Accordingly, I would also like to use Kuhn's term paradigm as a purely descriptive term. That means without the fundamental implications of scientific theory that Kuhn tried to give it as early as 1962 and in his following clarifications, manifold clarifications. So I stop here and skip a passage where I try to bring in certain elements of Popper's criticism and the attempt of a German theoretician of history, Jörn Rüsen, to reshape the practice of history according to Kuhn and move immediately to the second paragraph, the attempt to remodel with Kuhn's ideas and to criticize Kuhn's ideas by looking to the history of research to the phenomenon which we label ancient Gnosticism. If one wants to use Kuhn's insights to understand the course of research to any phenomenon in history, and I have chosen as example one field of my research, Gnosticism, one could understand antiquity itself as the first phase of the development. There is in Kuhn an attempt to order and to arrange the development of a scientific discipline in regard of their relation to paradigms. According to Kuhn, in a pre-paradigmatic phase, there is disagreement in scholarship about fundamental questions and orientations, so plurality in the beginning. Different projects and methodologies compete in a quasi-pluralistic manner. One might have to critically object here that there can be no science at all without paradigms, but I would like to try to identify fundamental characteristics of the pre-paradigmatic phase, according to Kuhn, in the study of ancient Gnosticism. So, where is Kuhn's pre-paradigmatic phase? For it seems to me that the attempts of the mainstream Christianity or majority Church authors since the 2nd century to understand the falsely so-called knowledge, that's a formulation from the first letter to Timothy, where for the first time as a source, this movement, which we now label ancient Gnosticism, is thematized by an author. So the interesting question is whether this first phase, where ancient Christians are trying to describe the movement which we today label ancient Gnosticism, is the pre-paradigmatic phase of Kuhn. Despite all their commonality, still those mainstream Christian authors, I will skip the names, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Epiphanius of Salamis, when describing the Gnostics, the people of knowledge, verbally translated, then this is a pre-paradigmatic phase because there are quite different concepts, quite different ideas, and no leading paradigm. The only leading perspective, so to say, is the perspective written here unfriendly in the Greek language, because here is said that the addressee of the letter, Timothy, is warned to follow the unspiritual loose talk and the bickering of what is falsely called knowledge, which some people proclaim they have strayed from the faith. That's no paradigm, that's a kind of perspective. And so I would label the ancient attempts, the wake phenomenon, the large number of groups to portray or to get an image as the pre-paradigmatical phase. According to Kuhn, a second phase of the scientific development is initially characterized by one predominant paradigm. And now I apologize. For reasons of one lecture, it's impossible to give a complete overview about the modern research on the so-called knowledge, the Gnostic movement, Gnosticism. And I skip, I apologize, the most interesting phase. Guy has portrayed the beginning of research in religious history with two wonderful books. And so we should start in the 17th century following Guy's ideas. But I apologize, I started in the 19th century with German people because the research on the French people and the English people you have done, and you should better write down a complete history on the research on Gnosticism following Guy's insights and ideas. This paragraph would be far more longer than it is. It's a boring German attempt, and the French alterations and widenings up you will give in the next lecture from this place. Kuhn calls the second phase characterized by one single paradigm, the normal phase, because it is dominated by, I quote, recognized examples of concrete scientific practice, examples that include law, theory, application, and tools, and that provide models from which certain firmly established traditions of scientific research grow. Finally, according to Kuhn's model of the second paradigmatic phase, at some point, paradigm internal anomalies occur. Anomalies. Problems that cannot be solved in the prevailing paradigm. According to Kuhn, this crisis of the old paradigm leads to a scientific revolution. That's a book of the 60s. Revolution is of interest in American universities. also in the MIT, to a paradigm shift in the course of which an old paradigm is replaced by a new paradigm through revolution. My thesis, which I will illustrate by a German-centered, I apologize, perspective on the history on Gnosticism, is that Kuhn's model is far too static, insofar as it overestimates the originality of the leading theories. It's not a revolution. It's a far more quiet progress of discussion. He overestimates the originality in the rapid change of paradigms. And what looks to us as a rapid change is sometimes and often fashion-driven. It's fashion to have something new in, and in fact, it is not a real new approach. It's the orange from 5 years ago. It's the dress from 10 years ago. Kuhn overestimates the radicality of the changes modeled in the political concept of revolution, fashion in the 60s. In other words, the changes of paradigms are less radical, often only reform and less revolution. The paradigms less originally, often only modification, repetition, pure fashion of cultural convention. And that I will argue with a, I confess, simplified, Eurocentric, German-centered perspective, but I promise if I will be invited for further lectures, I can explain it also for the English-speaking research, for the French-speaking research from the 17th century on. In order at least to begin to substantiate my key assumptions that Kuhn's model is far too static and overemphasizing the radicality of changes, I will begin my brief exploration of Gnosticism research with a famous Berlin church historian and academic administrator. This is one of Henry Moore, one of the people one should start when we would have a week for lectures. And this is Harnack, who was socialized in the Lutheran pietistic movement of the Baltic region and in the what in the German research is called Familienuniversität, Family University of Dorpat, deeply related to other families, the only German language university in the Russian Empire. Harnack interpreted Gnosticism as an acute Hellenization of Christianity. His corresponding formulations from his work, The History of Dogma, are well known, but the corresponding view is already laid down in the first works of the Dorpat student, Tartu student, and the Leipzig lecturer. Harnack considered Gnosticism to be the first culmination of the adoption of methods, standards, and theories of contemporary Greek philosophy, which means the simple preaching of Jesus reached the scientific level of the Greek world. Religion reached the level of university. Gnosticism, so, was no pre-Christian movement in terms of its historical origin, and not a non-Christian movement in terms of its content, but the first attempt to inculturate a religion from abroad into the Roman Empire and the Greek-Roman civilization, so to say, in the Greek-Roman civilization, which ended with the University of Dorpat. According to Harnack himself, he adopted this thesis interestingly, from his arch enemy and intimate opponent Franz Overbeck, Nietzsche's friend. And there is also Paul Wendland, but I skip some of the explanations on the term Hellenism and Hellenization by Harnack and move a little bit further. Harnack's image of Gnosticism as an adoption of methods, standards, and theories of Greek scientific reflection was disseminated by the very enterprising author in various forms of his own textbooks. Not only the large 3-volume history of dogma, but small introductions for students, textbook for priests and ministers, newspaper articles, a whole production disseminated this paradigm of interpretation of Gnosticism. The vast majority of students of theology, until well into the middle of the 20th century, when the whole paradigm changed, other words, was acquainted with this traditional paradigm. If one interprets the development with a theoretical background of Kuhn's ideas, one would therefore have to speak of a very rapid revolutionary development in the questions of paradigms that was during the lifetime of Harnack a new paradigm, which we will face immediately, but the revolution was unknown to larger parts of the community, students and publicly interested people. Perhaps we can use the famous storming of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, 1917, as point of comparison, which was not as significant as Lenin's followers would have us believe for a long time. So no one realized in the German academia that there was a revolution, and this revolution was linked with 2 researchers, the New Testament scholar Wilhelm Busset and the history of religion scholar and classical philologist Richard Reitzenstein. A completely new approach. Both of them taught for a time in Göttingen. Busset and Reitzenstein had argued with great determination in favor of understanding Gnosticism, and now the exact opposite to Harnack, as an essentially not only pre-Christian, Harnack thought a Christian, they thought pre-Christian, but also non-Christian movement of thought, which was based on a very specific myth, the myth of the redeemed Redeemer, originating from Persia. So not the acquaintance to the German traditional Greco-Roman university system, but from abroad, Persia, a myth, something completely alien to the culture, to the Greco-Roman based culture of the German Empire of the beginning of the 20th century. Busset described the myth as follows, and I quote him: "There was an ancient myth in which it was reported that the world was created by the sacrifice of a primordial man, an Urmenschen, formed from his body. This myth was given a new twist as the Greek world of thought became intertwined with Oriental fantasies, the Orientalization of Greco-Roman culture. The primordial man sacrificed at the beginning of the creation of the world now became the pro-anthropos, Greek for the pre-human, the firstborn of the supreme deity, who at the beginning of the development of the world sank down into matter, or was lured down into matter, and thus gave the impetus for the development of the world." According to Richard Reitzenstein, this mythological concept already existed in Iran which conceives the soul or the inner human being as a divine being that is sent down from the world of light into matter and is freed and recalled from it again. The interesting question is, why on earth this completely opposite paradigm to Harnack's Christian and post-Christian development, pre-Christian and non-Christian myth, a myth in the beginning and not the rational argumentation according to the standards and methodologies of the Greco-Roman culture. And if we are asking with Kuhn anomalies, certain surprising findings were the reason why a new paradigm was adopted. And these reasons, I will skip a little bit, were codices text findings. Certain texts which were already published when Harnack was a student in Dorpat, but were neglected by him. Harnack thought uninteresting texts by simple-minded people which we should neglect. Busset and Reitzenstein focused these texts and put those texts in the center. So there were not new discoveries responsible for the new paradigm, but a new estimation of findings Harnack also could have read but have neglected and not used for constructing his paradigm. The interesting thing is now that this paradigm was popularized in the 20th century by a Dutch scholar, and it would be also of interest to talk a little bit longer about him. I will talk a little bit shorter about him, because to my impression, Gil Quispel, a Dutch scholar, interestingly, his lifetime professor of church history at a Dutch university, Quispel popularized this paradigm and popularized it with wonderful formulations and said, this is a world religion. A world religion, and this world religion to certain phases of history incarnates, and Gnosticism is the Jewish Christian incarnation of a world religion which one can observe, for example, by the Bogemols or by the Cathars. So Gnosticism is everywhere, and the myth is deep in the soul, and we have certain historical concrete formulations. There were also new texts, the findings of Nag Hammadi, which I will explain a little bit later in greater detail. What is now of interest for me is the canonization of this paradigm in a large congress, in the Congress on Gnosticism in Messina in the year 1966. And in the Congress of Messina, a definition was given. So now the paradigm, there were slight alterations between Busset, Reitzenstein on one side and Quispel on the other side, which I skip now. This paradigm was coined in a clear-cut definition. And this definition was given in the beginning of the proceedings of the Congress in a lot of languages. So in the German language, in the Italian language, in the French language, in the English language, so that the paradigm now, as Kuhn observes, is not to be discussed, but can be learned by learning the definitions by heart. This definition came from the Dutch history of religion scholar Bleecker, who was well acquainted with Quispel, and the German history of religion scholar Carsten Kolpe, who was still teaching in Göttingen at the time. And this text not only incorporated the definition important historical insights, but also contained a terminological proposal. And this terminological proposal is the simplification of a large paradigm to clear-cut formulations, regulations, norms, how to use language. So it helped to create a widespread paradigm which one could teach to students instead of the older paradigm of Harnack. And especially in those years, the older classroom and textbooks disappeared, and the new paradigm with a new definition, widespread, was introduced to European universities and other institutions of higher learning. What was the definition? The definition was that the idea was that one should distinguish between two terms. Gnosis, knowledge, is a knowledge of divine mysteries reserved for an elite. And in contrast to this more typologically oriented definition of the first term, gnosis, they separated from gnosis, the typological definition of a knowledge of divine mysteries reserved for an elite, a more historically oriented definition of Gnosticism. So the key point of the definition from Messina is to distinguish between gnosis and Gnosticism, which help the ideas of Quispel and to a certain extent of Busset and Reitzenstein to present in a quite simple, clear-cut way. Two terms, Gnosis and Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was defined as a certain group of systems from the 2nd century AD. So the typological definition of Gnosis was enlarged, or it was added a second, more historically oriented definition. So, interestingly, it is not only a revolution that a paradigm was replaced, Harnack's paradigm, and the anomalies were not anomalies visible by a certain discovery in a certain year, but were seen as anomalies, and revolution was indeed the way of declaring something like in the Russian Revolution in 1917 as a revolutionary moment, which was in fact a series of happenings and a series of certain events in history. And also it is necessary, like in the Russian Revolution, to fix the new paradigm in quite simple and clear sentences. And the 1966 definition of the Congress of Messina, interestingly, came a lot of years later, 50 years later, than the paradigm arose. And the interesting thing I would now, at the last part of this second part of my second paragraph of the lecture, remember is that in the volume I have shown to you here, the sharpest critique of the paradigm, of the new paradigm, is included. And when I was a young student and working in the dissertation, my academic teacher, and the reason she was a woman, so I thought you should have an image of her, Luisa Abramowski said to me as a young doctoral student, read the volume carefully. There is the sharpest critique of the paradigm included. And the sharpest critique of the paradigm included was a person probably known to all of you, Hans Jonas. Hans Jonas published in the Congress volume a quite sharp article titled Delimitation of the Gnostic Phenomenon, Typologically and Historical. And he said, between the lines, but quite clearly readable for everyone carefully reading Jonas' article, that the idea to construct such a wide concept, gnosis, defined as a knowledge of divine mysteries reserved for an elite, is absurd and leads to extremely difficult consequences. And so the title, Delimitation, is meant quite earnestly. And the interesting thing is that Jonas himself revised his own dissertation. The dissertation he wrote together with Rudolf Bultmann and Martin Heidegger in Marburg. So it's an element of self-critique. And Jonas said, when I was as a young doctoral student looking for the phenomenon of Gnosticism, I should have done what I now propose to do, not to widen up definitions and not to extend the phenomenon to pre-Christian world religion and all these things, but only to study things in the first 3 centuries AD, and to ask the question, how is the relation between Judaism, Christianity, Greek philosophy, other things will mislead us. So interestingly, the high peak of the paradigm of the so-called religionsgeschichtliche Schule was indeed bound together with the sharpest critique of the paradigm, and all thing what happened after, I think, is to a certain extent not directly moved by Jonas' article, but the ideas of Jonas' article were in the following years expressed by a lot of other people and helped to overcome the paradigm. I don't want now to describe the overcoming of the Messina paradigm, the paradigm of the so-called religionsgeschichtliche Schule, Busset, Reitzenstein, Quispel, Messina, because I would have to speak about myself, and that one should avoid. But I followed as a young doctoral student the idea of Jonas, but did one mistake. And about my own mistake, I would like to utter 2 or 3 sentences, because in the contrast to Kuhn's idea of a progress in the development of paradigms, there are from time to time counter-revolutions. And one of my academic teachers, Martin Hengel, now present in Jerusalem because he donated to Hebrew University his famous library at Mount Scopus. The Hengel Library is visible. My academic teacher, Martin Hengel, proposed to skip the Messina paradigm and to go back to Harnack's paradigm. I would label this counter-revolution, to go back to the last paradigm and ignoring all things what happened. And I have to confess, I'm happy that no of the reviewers realized this, that in my dissertation I followed a little bit too much the idea of counter-revolution. So Kuhn's idea of a constant progress from one paradigm to the next, a progress history, is wrong. There are always regressions, and there are always counter-revolutions, reforms back to former paradigms. And what my other academic teacher, Martin Hengel, did, is to a certain extent such an attempt of counter-revolution, reform against, reform back, conservative revolution. And also I'm extremely thankful to my academic teachers. I think one should be free to address this critique, especially if oneself followed such ideas. I skip attempts to construct a new paradigm according to certain postmodern strategies. The person to the left tried to establish a new paradigm. There was no Gnosticism. We should avoid the term. That's essentialist. There are only different systems, and it's not allowed to bring those systems under one common rubric. I skip this because that's an attempt. This afternoon, one of my colleagues from the Hebrew University said there are pseudo-paradigms, and this is the postmodern paradigm, and to explain it, it would be probably a little bit boring. What I would like to do at the last part of this second paragraph of the lecture is asking the question, is there a new paradigm inside visible? And I think that there is a new paradigm. And this new paradigm is closely combined with a research group in Oslo and with the Oslo historian of Coptic language and monasticism, Hugo Lundhaug. Hugo Lundhaug observed that the large text findings from the year 1945 of Coptic texts, certain codices found in a place somewhere in Middle Egypt and labeled since the 50s as the findings of Nag Hammadi, are wrongly attributed to Gnostic communities. And Lundhaug realized from these are the codices in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, and Lundhaug realized from the binding papyri in those leather codices that those texts were written, bound, and read in Coptic monasteries of the majority church. So these are text findings from a Coptic monastery, and interestingly, from a Coptic monastery which was famous for the Pachomian monastic movement and is labeled with the Greek term Kenoboskion, the place for the gooses, where the gooses are held. And so it's not the question, are these Christian texts, are these heretical texts, are these non-Christian texts, is answered. These are texts in a monastic library, and there are traces of that monks read those texts. And when looking to the texts of the Gnostic movement from this perspective, you easily can realize that a lot of those texts, where we know the history of these texts, coming up from Coptic monasteries. They were held in Coptic monastery libraries. They were used by monks, and monks used those texts for religious entertainment and for religious learning. This is the philological observation of Lundhaug. That's an anomaly for both perspectives. It's not a university reflection like Harnack thought. It's not a reflection of non-Christian pupils of a Persian or Iranian myth. It's literature for monks to read. And this completely will change the paradigm, but it's also no revolution because the observations are discussed at the moment and we are far away from a new paradigm. This is only a first step concerning a new paradigm, and perhaps in 2 or 3 years, when I have finished a large monograph on Gnosticism I'm writing at the moment, I can present a next step to the paradigm. This was an attempt to present to you a complex history of research to a phenomenon in 3 steps. The idea of Harnack that the inculturation of Christianity and reaching the level of university teaching and university reflection on religion was at first reached by Gnostics. The completely opposite paradigm, that it wasn't a Christian reflection on Christian religion, but outside reflection coming up from Persian, Iranian ways, and it's a mythological idea of telling a myth, which that was Quispel's idea, deeply rooted in the soul of every human person, and then with a Messina definition brought to a clear-cut, learnable, readable version of the paradigm. And then the paradigm collapsed because one author in the volume of the proceedings of the conference warned against the general structure of the paradigm. Don't widen up the idea of your paradigm, that will help it to collapse. And then the observation of the Norwegian group, these texts are misinterpreted because their original place, the libraries of Coptic monasteries, was neglected. So we can move to the third and last concluding section, a very short section, Paradigms in the History of Ancient Religion, some conclusions. It cannot be denied that Thomas Kuhn's insights into the significance of paradigms, which basically go back to the German Enlightenment philosopher Lichtenberg and were delivered to Kuhn by Wittgenstein and the Polish-Israeli biologist and philosopher of science Ludwig Fleck, which I have skipped completely, can be made fruitful for an analysis of the research history of religions in antiquity. No doubt. There is something with Kuhn which, matters. There is something with Kuhn which made it fruitful to use him to analyze. But, and as I said, the buts are of interest. What Kuhn describes as a paradigm characterizes the progress of research, yes. And the paradigms, there is Kuhn also right, are at least in part rather unconsciously adopted as part of scientific culture. Kuhn's studies were written before the success of cultural history, so one has to discuss the culture of scientific institutions and scientific development, but with such a discussion one can realize the influence of paradigms. There Kuhn is right. And Kuhn is also right that there is often an uncritical attitude, but only often. In the volume, in the Congress volume of the Messina Congress, there is the sharp critical attitude of Hans Jonas against a consensus. So not all in the second and third generation are uncritical, and not all in the second and third generation are taking paradigms unconsciously and are not thinking about those paradigms. Jonas is the counter-example. And I'm quite sure not all criticizing the Messina paradigm have read Hans Jonas, but all of them follow path he has opened and are criticizing following Jonas without knowing Jonas. So Kuhn is right unconsciously, but he is not right. Some are with conscious critically. Rather, we saw that Kuhn's model is far too static. That's quite clear. There are hidden revolutions, there are counter-revolutions, there are late revolutions, there are attempts to design things as revolution, like the storm into the Winter Palace. And we saw not only that Kuhn's model is far too static, it overestimates the originality of leading theories. Harnack's theory is without any originality. When I would have introduced the researchers from the 17th century on, it would immediately quite clear that Harnack's paradigm, which is always linked with Harnack, is in fact a quite classical paradigm, without any originality, but it was presented always as Harnack's paradigm. So overestimation of the originality of paradigms is one of the problems of Kuhn's theory. And the rapid change of paradigms is often linked with certain questions of cultural situation. And Kuhn is the best example. It's a theory about revolution. This is 60s at universities in the US. I'm talking about reforms and far more slower progress. This is Germany of the 90s and 80s when I was trained. So one can, in a self-critical way, adopt the observations on Kuhn also on Marx. Rather, there are peaceful syntheses between paradigms. This is also of interest, not only revolutions and one paradigm against the other, but there are peaceful syntheses possible and counter-revolutions in favor of older paradigms. Once again, the changes in paradigms are less radical, often only reform and less revolution, sometimes even counter-revolution. Conversely, the paradigms are less original, often just modification. And occasionally, everyone feels the same way as the current research into the falsely so-called knowledge, gnosis. We observe anomalies, and the interesting thing is we observe. They appear earlier. The texts Busset and Reitzenstein took as the starting point for their theory were published in the midst of the 19th century. The student Harnack had the chance to read them. He neglected those texts. May believe that the old paradigms is in crisis, but there is no new one yet. So it remains exciting. With the research into Gnosticism as well as with a discussion on Kuhn's theories and paradigms, we are not at the end, but this lecture ends now. Many thanks for your patience.
I think it's very late, but if there is one or two brief questions, maybe Professor Makris will be able to give one or two brief answers. But so, please, Gidi. The mic. Please.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I wanted to ask about this thing about counter-revolutions and returns to previous paradigms. Isn't that something that's typical of the humanities and maybe social sciences and will not happen in the hard sciences that Kuhn was talking about?
That's a temptation because I'm a hardcore humanities person. But I try to talk about one of the last Nobel Prize winners in physics, Anton Zeilinger and his observations on quantum physics. As far I understood Zeilinger's research in quantum physics, he, by an experimental approach, was able to argue in favor of something which Einstein thought is completely absurd. The Einstein term is spukhafte Fernwirkung, that in a non-Newtonian way, things are related in quantum relations, and Einstein thought that's impossible. So seen from the perspective of Einstein, it's a counter-revolution, something which cannot be proved and is an absurd idea, which he brought out, is now worth of a Nobel Prize. But I think the problem of my term counter-revolution is it depends on the perspective. I would think Max Planck, for example, would be extremely happy what happened, and he would imagine Zeilinger's observation a kind of development of his own theory. So it's depending on the perspective. Seen from the perspective of Einstein, counter-revolution. Seen from the perspective of Max Planck, a pure development of a theory. And so my impression is whether one thing is labeled as progress or regress is depending, and my impression is perhaps a short answer to your question. I'm far too long in answering it. It's more obvious in the humanities, but I could perhaps, if I would be more familiar with the discussions in the sciences, right? That's the wonderful thing in an academy. Academy can discuss whether there is a hidden form of counter-revolutions also in the sciences. I would suppose.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Yes, please, the last question.
I don't know if it's really connected to what you talked about, but since you mentioned Nag Hammadi,
yeah,
I don't know if you read Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code.
Yes, for sure.
If you do,
yeah.
I know that there is a big discussion now about the role of Miriam Magdalene, Maria Magdalena, in the spread of Christianity. Do you have any comment about it?
Yes, for sure. I was invited to a podium to discuss Dan Brown, and so I went to watch the movie. And I was so bored that I slept away. Also, all people around me were excited, and so no. The interesting thing with Dan Brown, I think, is not in regard of Mary Magdalene or such things, but in the church in Paris, Saint-Sulpice, the priest put a small announcement: don't try to open the floor. And this is quite interesting, because a piece of literature, fiction, is able to harm the floor of a church, because there is said, if you dig there, you will find. And that's quite interesting, because in the modern media society, the idea that we, the scientists, are able to distinguish between solid science, rocket science on one side, and then fake news and absurd theories, and we have a certain influence, so that an Academy of Sciences and Humanities, for example, is able to ornate hard science and to refuse absurd theories. I think in the social media society, this idea is in danger. Dan Brown is able to move people to attack the floor of a church and to dig for remains of Mary Magdalene. I have forgotten what is under the floor, but it's a wonderful church with a beautiful organ. No need to open the floor. And so the Dan Brown thing is of interest in the way how the strict border between fiction and facts is a fuzzy border, and the interesting self-critical question is whether certain hermeneutical theories in the humanities helped to harm the border between fact and fiction. And so it would be a nice idea to analyze self-critically how we dealt with fact and fiction.
I thank you again, Christophe, for this masterful tour d'horizon, which, for me at least, created another number of very long questions, or questions very long to answer. So thank you very much. And